Why'd you stop it at the best bit? I was rather enjoying that.
In early 1985, Doctor Who was put on ice by the BBC with what became known as the 18-month hiatus. It was a gap year and a bit that saw the show go from a confident perennial in the schedules to a wounded beast limping on. When the show came back in autumn of 1986, the program was effectively on trial, so it sort of made sense to put the Doctor himself on trial in The Trial of a Time Lord.
This is an impartial inquiry into the behaviour of the accused person, known as the Doctor.
In many ways, the behind-the-scenes drama of the 23rd season is just a little bit more interesting than the actual 14 episodes. The gist was, the people at the top of the BBC in early 1985, BBC One controller Michael Grade and head of drama Jonathan Powell, were not well disposed towards Doctor Who, that's putting it mildly. They would rather use the programme's budget for their own projects, and so they quietly cancelled Doctor Who. TV broadcasters can opt to cancel or not renew a series for various reasons. There's ratings, a star wants to move on, or the makers have reached the end of the story hoping to go out on top. In case of Doctor Who, the BBC's decision to cancel was motivated mainly, it seems, out of pure spite.
A clever ploy. You'll see.
This was a spite cancellation, like when you cancel your subscription to Amazing Nintendo Forever magazine when it only gave Ocarina of Time 11.5 out of 10.
It spoils everything.
The show's producer John Nathan Turner and script editor Eric Saywood first heard the news through the grapevine, rather than from their bosses. There's a potentially awkward moment in the BBC lift there and then.
The crime was in being there, Doctor!
Nathan Turner sprung into action, briefing fans and journalists about the BBC's inner workings, the supposedly true motivations behind the cancellations, all of the merchandising and foreign sales that Grade and Powell were metaphorically flushing down the drain as if the police had knocked on their front door. J&T kept out of the public campaign for reasons of plausible deniability, but the plan worked. The BBC attempted to dig themselves out of the mess of their own making with their own self-serving statements, which of course ignored major pertinent facts, like using a GPS to find a flat earther convention.
Is there any intelligent life here?
Grade and Powell, or GAP for short, felt Doctor Who was cheap and tatty, but conveniently ignored the fact that they also controlled its budget and the amount of time allowed for production. The production team didn't have a handle on the series, though it was GAP who left them to their own devices and wouldn't even countenance replacing them. Ratings were terrible. They were basically the same as the Peter Davison era, when it was considered good. But then of course the show was now on Saturday night. The show's violence was getting out of hand, which is almost a fair cop, until you remember Powell's job was to read and approve all scripts ahead of production. What they never said was, hey, we hate the show and we want to spend the money on shows we personally like, and everybody else can right off. We say we've got money issues, so we will cancel one of the few shows that brings in more money than it costs to make. Wow, that escalated.
Brom brom sabaluna.
Yeah.
Grade had already had target practice at the bullseye on his loafers when he pulled the popular nighttime soap Dallas from the schedules.
What?
The public outcry at the time was but a preview of what was to come. Still, to get out of their self-made PR nightmare, the Beebs' fake hiatus became a real one, and the show would be back in 1986. An 18-month hiatus between seasons was, at the time, the longest break between new episodes. Here in the 21st century, you ain't seen nothing yet. So in short, the series was unofficially cancelled but officially delayed. Privately shit-canned but publicly on vacay. The one thing that was consistent internally and externally was Grade and Powell's constant shit-posting about the show.
I was trying not to state the obvious.
Of course, all of this blew up just as the original season 23 was meant to go into production, which meant writers for the unused scripts were still paid for their work, including former producer Graham Williams, who'd written The Return of the Celestial Toymaker, who of course was originally played by Michael Gough.
It's Michael Gough, it's Michael Gough.
Robert Holmes also had a story about the Autons in the works, and the series regulars were still under contract, so they got paid even without making new episodes. The BBC basically got stuck with the fees trying to pay out the mobile phone contract. For a while, the intention was to continue with the series already in the pipeline, but in the middle of 1985, it was announced in a show of the BBC's supreme confidence in the series that the 23rd season would not only be back to 25-minute episodes, but there would now only be 14 of them, the shortest season of the original series to date. Basically, the Doctor had his hours cut from full-time to a 0-hour contract. In the meantime, there was a Doctor Who radio play, Slipback, featuring Colin Baker and Nicola Bryant. But even more cheekily, Michael Grade was on hand to launch a travelling Doctor Who exhibition built into a semi-trailer to promote the series in the US, where it was becoming more and more popular. So he would promote the show that he was trying to kill. Now this is what you call a big business brain here. Michael Grade was well on his way toward becoming the first man to step on the sun.
Well, that sounds more like an insult than a diagnosis, Mr. Glitz.
You're right there, my lad.
The show would of course return in September of 1986, again in a Saturday evening time slot in the UK. With the reduction of both episode count and length, it was clear to the production team that a new approach was needed. But without much guidance from their disinterested bosses, it was up to the Doctor Who production team to somehow right the ship without second-guessing themselves too much. More humour and less violence was about all they could wrangle from the likes of Grade and Powell.
Can't you accept we're on the brink of disaster?
Script editor Eric Sayward felt that as the show itself was on trial, why not put the Doctor on trial? It's very meta. And so the original scripts for the season were dropped in favour of 4 interlinked stories where the Doctor is put on trial by the Time Lords once again. Although every episode is titled Trial of a Time Lord, in reality the season is broken up into 3 4-part stories, presented as evidence in a trial like a telling of a Christmas Carol if the main character was dressed like an irradiated clown. At the end, there'd be a 2-part story to wrap everything up.
I protest!
What now?
Yes, now!
I meant, what are you protesting about this time?
The first 4 episodes are known off-screen as The Mysterious Planet. The TARDIS is captured and brought to a Gallifreyan space station in what was the single most impressive special effect ever seen on the original series, and a rare use of motion-controlled technology on the series. It was a nice effect, a really nice effect, and it did blow much of the budget to try and shake the feeling that Doctor Who was tatty and cheap, but that was a bit self-defeating when you got to the rest of the season, which of course was not only tatty as usual, but cheap as usual. The Doctor wanders into a courtroom where a prosecutor known as the Valeyard indicts the Doctor on charges of interfering with time.
That the Doctor is an incorrigible meddler in the affairs of other peoples and planets.
Overseeing the inquiry, the Inquisitor. She offers the Doctor a court-appointed defender.
I think it will be easier if I speak for myself.
Of course, as we all know, anybody who defends themselves has a fool for a client. I mean, Uncle Reg is a lawyer, but he's also a crook who gets caught a lot. It will become apparent that the Valeyard is really keen for the Doctor to not only be found guilty of the crimes he's accused of, but, any other crimes he can think of along the way, where he will unilaterally change the terms of reference. Time Lord justice is blind, but in this case it's blind drunk.
I should like to begin with the Doctor's involvement in the affairs of Ravalox.
The Doctor and Peri find a planet that's remarkably similar to Earth, just in a different part of the galaxy. Then they quickly discover it's actually Earth all along, but instead of the Statue of Liberty, we get a tube station. Underground, the Doctor finds a group of survivors who are so desperate to retain their title of the worst dressed characters in Doctor Who that they decide to stone the Doctor. Their leader is Drathro, a robot whose function was to keep the survivors alive, but had no programming to tell it what to do once the planet was again habitable. Above the ground there's the Tribe of the Free, led by Queen Katrika, who worship the same antenna doodad that powers Drathro. Also on the planet are a pair of mercenaries, Glitz and Dibber, who are looking to find some valuable secrets that Drathro is in possession of.
The Sleepers found a way into the biggest net of information in the universe.
The nature of the stolen secrets has been redacted by the Time Lords, but viewers at the time would have to wait about 2 months for the one bit of information that would have made this whole story work. So narratively, it's a big post-dated check. By then nobody cared or remembered. But Mysterious Planet, written by Robert Holmes, could have been a highlight of the season. It has the writer's tart dialogue and a number of interesting characters, but is let down by some naff production in places and the fact that it was not the writer's best work. All told, it's flatter than a traffic cone at a steamroller driver training school. The constant flipping between Ravalox and the courtroom, along with the Doctor's incredibly lame insults, is tiresome. However, Michael Jayston and Linda Bellingham are always watchable in this, giving this season way more class than it deserves. Dotted throughout the story is a fair bit of acting that doesn't quite come off as well as you'd hope.
Why, Grell? Why?
On the other hand,
They'll kill the Doctor!
We've all got to go sometime, Peri.
Tony Selby as Glitz, along with his associate Dibber, are the highlights, delivering their lines as intended.
Of all the snivelling screeds to be stuck with in my moment of need, I have to get you two.
I know, depressing, isn't it?
Comedy star Joan Sims seems to have wandered into the wrong studio. Bless.
We go! Forward!
The L1 robot at least is a decent design, functional, though it does look like any operator would really suffer for their art.
Ow, my balls.
Colin Baker's performance is toned down in the Ravelock scenes, finally showing us what we wanted from his doctor. Somebody who was quirky, a little more charming, much less abrasive, unfortunately still dressed like somebody cosplaying as an explosion at a wallpaper convention. Costume aside, he's a fine doctor at last. Baker and Nicola Bryant agreed between themselves to play their lines in a less adversarial manner than before, and finally you could see why Peri would continue to travel with the Doctor. This lessening of the bickering finally makes them act as a believable team.
Purple Gillian Brown, but my friends call me Peri.
Also, Nicola Bryant was finally allowed a wardrobe that was more appropriate to the weather, or maybe she was just auditioning for a job pulling bingo numbers on a cruise ship. Of course, having everybody dressed in silly, colourful costumes does tend to squash the dramatic potential. If you can't take the characters seriously, it's really expecting a lot for the audience to take the drama seriously. It all starts with the Doctor's costume, which is somebody waving a road flare at a rave.
How can the boatyard make that claim?
The Doctor is on trial for his life, but this is what we get.
Smugness does not become you, Doctor.
That is an irrelevant observation.
Colin Baker is less restrained in the trial sequences for this story, with his propensity for bombast getting the better of him. Colin Baker does at least tone it down after this story. Perhaps seeing one of his co-stars exploding every 25 seconds got him to rein things in a bit. Before this season, most Doctor Who location footage was shot on film, and starting here, the location work would be recorded with multiple outside broadcast cameras. Effectively, it was a mobile, multi-camera television studio. It would get rid of the quality gap when cutting from location to studio, but it does make the whole production look even more like a sitcom.
A philanthropist, my son, is someone who gives away all their grotsits out of the simple goodness of their heart.
Oh, you mean they're stupid? Oh, yeah, you probably do look like one. Then.
Meanwhile, elsewhere within the BBC, more and more dramas were shot on film. The next 4 episodes, known collectively as Mindwarp, see the Doctor and Peri engaged in the adventure set just before the beginning of the trial, where the Doctor will find out why Peri wasn't with him in the courtroom. The Doctor wants to know who is selling energy weapons to primitive cultures, and the trail leads to Thoros Beta, home to the business-minded Mentors, a race we'd encountered the previous season in the form of Syl. Syl, the mentor, has a mentor called Kiv, who is both a mentor and a mentor to Syl, who is a mentor but not a mentor to anyone else. Kiv, the mentor, has an expanding brain giving him immense pain and has engaged the services of Dr. Frankenstein Crozier to give him a new body. The Doctor is used as a guinea pig by Crozier in one of his evil experiments, but things don't go so well. The good news is the Doctor is ruled out as a head donor, but the bad news, his personality has been affected. He's acting out of character and cozying up to the mentors while denouncing Peri.
An enemy, my lord!
We're never really sure what the deal with the Doctor was, whether he was affected, possessed, the Matrix was altered, or if he's just pretending. And we're also never quite sure exactly when he's restored to his usual self. Apparently the director, writer, and script editor had no idea either. This was convenient because after the show was broadcast, nobody at home had any idea. Hey, we might laugh when we hear stories about an actor asking,
"What is my motivation, dear boy?"
But at times like this, it is no joke. Something else that isn't a joke. Knock knock.
Who's there?
Doctor.
Doctor Who?
Yeah, it's a bit rubbish, isn't it? What we are left with is Peri hanging out with Brian Blessed, who does what Brian Blessed does on a good day. He shouts and he blusters. Like a lot. As the warrior king Yakanos, Blessed is ready to explode, as if they installed a Bunsen burner next to a fuel bowser. But here he also says weird words and makes random sounds.
Brom brom. Savaluna.
I'd like to say for dramatic effect. I'd like to, I really would. The seemingly deranged Doctor hangs out with Syl, bonding with his former foe. Meanwhile, Crozier continues to give the Doctor the evil eye. Not literally, of course, but Crozier was such a good surgeon I wouldn't really put anything past him. With Kiv rapidly approaching death, Crozier decides Peri is the best candidate.
Shave her head. I've decided to attempt direct transference.
And implants Kiv's mind into her head. Wah? Well, that is certainly going to make for some awkward family reunions.
I have altered the basis of all future life.
By now, the Doctor had been taken out of time by the Time Lords and is left to Brian Blessed to deal with Peri. Well, just wow. They killed Peri, but we'll come back to that.
With the discovery that Crozier had made, the whole course of natural evolution throughout the universe would be affected.
Mindwarp is a weird one. Maybe how you respond to it is dependent on your mood, but there have been times where I've enjoyed watching it and times where I've hated it.
Please hurry! Balloon egg! We'll release the slaves and then on to death!
It can be quite unpleasant in its subject matter, implies a lot of horrific concepts, and does seem like an own goal for a series trying to clean up its act.
You must understand, we can't allow your bodies and skulls to be retrieved undamaged.
There's little actual physical violence per se, unless you count Brian Blessed's assault on his co-star's eardrums. Oh, of course, there's that whole matter of killing a companion when her brain is erased. Doctor Who had great success in the mid-70s, with a few seasons trading on gothic horror elements, including a story about a brain transplant. But this story is generally confusing without multiple rewatches. It also unfortunately does not improve once you can follow what's going on.
The legend sing and Hiatus, the great warlord, and also Hiatus, the even greater liberator!
Visually, Mindwarp probably looks one of the best from the mid-80s. It has actual atmospheric lighting and decent production design. And it's more surprising that this came from Ron Jones, who was one of the more workmanlike directors working on the series in the 80s.
How useful to have a Time Lord in one's employ.
Nabil Shaban returns as Syl, this time having the Doctor as an unreliable ally for a stretch. Kiv was played by Christopher Wright, who would return to the series years later as a Sontaran, but at the time was best known as Mike from The Young Ones.
And you knew that anyway, and we don't care, so where's the surprise?
Of course, don't be surprised if we cut and paste this last bit for when we get round to covering Series 4. Seeing a little bit more of the mentors is cool, and they've got a good handle on the makeup for the most part. It's not all smiles and sunshine in the design department. Here we get a pteroleptal costume repainted to look like a Geordie Shore cast member. Nicola Bryant was ready to leave the series after her 3-year contract was up. She had told JNT that she really wanted to go out dramatically. Well, bald and blown up is fairly dramatic. It's also the only time in the series that she was able to speak in something close to her own accent, if not her own pitch.
Oh, I like this!
And in the end, she'd actually appear in the series for 1 episode longer than Colin Baker.
American woman, stay away from me. American woman, mama let me be.
I was taken out of time for another reason, and I have every intention of finding out what it is.
With the Time Lords apparently having executed Peri to prevent Crozier's research from spreading, the Doctor begins his defense in a foul mood. He's chosen to show us an adventure from his own future with a companion he's not even met, which seems totally sensible. Look, I'm sure you hadn't noticed, but the Doctor had acquired a little post-holiday chonkiness. His new companion turns out to be a fitness freak who's going to try to get him fighting fit.
Carrot juice!
It'll do you good.
Melanie Bush is a computer programmer from Peas Pottage, though why you'd want to put peas in a pot I'd have no idea.
The answer's simple enough. You've got a killer on board.
As a computer programmer, Mel never once goes near one in the show, nor displays any knowledge of them. She's also quite appalling, or to give the actor the benefit of the doubt, appallingly written.
The word should be criminal.
As scripted, Mel's dialogue is a bunch of walking young adult mystery cliches, like if Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys joined Scooby-Doo to play Cluedo.
The quickest way out of this is to solve the mystery.
She's spunky, fearless, but also she comes off as a precocious preteen in a Nickelodeon series.
We were restricted to the passenger quarters. This is only the lounge.
Bonnie Langford, who seems a genuinely nice person in interviews, was at the time best known for her child roles in television and stage musicals. I mean, she was in Bugsy Malone, and of course any number of popular stage musicals of the time. To say the news of her casting was welcomed with open arms by viewers is the polar opposite of reality, a bit like reading Facebook posts, especially Auntie Beryl's Facebook posts, where she denies her relationship with Bigfoot. Mel would be a little less on the nose the following season at least. A little less. As this adventure happens in the Doctor's future, the story is the closest we'll ever get to an introductory story for Mel.
Young woman.
Melanie, known as Mel.
Also, this is a script from Pip and Jane Baker, so there's lots of verbosity.
Brown study. Is the vocabulary of all the Time Lords so antediluvian?
On the space cruiser Hyperion 3, something foul is afoot, and it's not purely the Doctor's coat. In a thinly disguised whodunit, we have a bunch of passengers, a grumpy captain, a henpecked security officer, a stewardess, a random old guy, some aliens, some scientists, and an undercover agent who's been rumbled in the opening minutes to the story. The Doctor and Mel respond to a mayday, which will later turn out to be a direct invitation. Dead bodies start piling up across the ship, and Mel is almost killed when some experimental plants are for some reason booby-trapped.
We don't want you breaking your neck. At least not until...
What we have is 4 episodes of the guy from GP, the guy from Lovejoy, the woman from the Avengers, in a story where the ship is taken over by one guy, then taken over by some other people, and then finally some killer plants turn up, and what the hell is that? They look like that guy from Work, Jonathan Livingston Vulva. The Vervoids are colourful bipedal triffids, and any metaphorical resemblance to my mate Dave is purely coincidental, because he sure acts like these things look. Last I heard he was trying to sell roundabouts in Milton Keynes. Terror of the Vervoids is okay. Really, not great, but not terrible. It's just ordinary and average. By the end of the story, the Valiant has once again moved the trial's goalposts.
The charge must now be genocide.
So, 12 episodes down and 2 episodes left, but this is where we return to the behind-the-scenes shenanigans. By the end of the season, script editor Eric Saywood's working relationship with producer John Nathan Turner had deteriorated to the point of Saywood throwing up his hands into the air and walking away. Head of drama Jonathan Powell wasn't going to waste a perfectly good BBC script editor on a show he wasn't interested in, so J&T's options were firstly to try and persuade Saywood to stay, and when that didn't work out, do the job himself for the remainder of the season. Where this would really hit the show was when it came time to finalise the scripts for the last 2 episodes. That would wrap up the season and the trial storyline. The original intention was for Robert Holmes to write the last 2 episodes, but ill health had caught up with the writer. He was only able to complete a draft on episode 13 before taken seriously ill and soon passed away. Saywood rewrote much of the episode and took on the job of finishing the last episode as a freelancer, until several things derailed that plan. Saywood found himself wanting off the show as a script editor. He'd become friendly with Robert Holmes in the veteran writer's later years and didn't like how writers were treated by the show's producer. Saywood continued to write the final episode as a freelancer, but he became increasingly annoyed at the script notes he was getting from J&T. The original ending planned by Saywood, Holmes and J&T was that the Doctor and Valiant would be locked in battle without a clear resolution. J&T got cold feet about this ending, fearing that viewers who'd watched a season-long story that wasn't actually wrapped up in the final episode would be a little bit alienated. And more importantly, anything that could serve as a series finale could encourage the BBC to end the series for good. This is one of the few decisions made by J&T from this era that in hindsight was totally the correct way to go. Because, you know, why hand your assassin a loaded gun? But for Saywood, this was the straw that broke the camel's back, and he cut all ties with the series, even going so far as to revoke permission for the BBC to use his final episode. J&T went to his fallback position, hiring Pip and Jane Baker to come up with a final episode that wrapped up the season, where they'd also have to do it in 3 days so production could proceed, and for legal reasons they were not to be influenced by Saywood's script in any way.
You really are a second-rate adversary. Did you imagine I'd be lured by such a transparent ploy?
Eric Saywood would soon give an interview to Starburst magazine that was not only going to list all of J&T's faults, but he would also throw Colin Baker under a bus. Either way, what's done is done, and there is little point in crying over spilt milk. However, spill the gin and it's war. Most seasons of Doctor Who were made under various pressures. Usually it was time and money. But this year, with, if not the sword of Damocles, at least the sword of his younger brother, Dan, hanging over the series. So you can understand why everybody was in a bad mood. While a new title sequence was considered, a compromise step was a new treatment for Ron Grainer's theme tune. Newcomer Dominic Glenn had sent a demo tape to various producers in the hope of attracting a commission, and one of those was J&T. Since 1980, Doctor Who had been scored by the BBC Radiophonic Workshop and its team of in-house composers. But as cheap bastards often say, change is as good as a holiday. You cheap bastard. Glenn provided scores for 2 stories this season, with Rocky Horror Show collaborator Richard Hartley providing music for Mindwarp and old hand Malcolm Clark producing a score for Terror of the Vervoids, which would be his last work on the series. The Radiophonic Workshop would continue to provide the show's custom sound effects for the remainder of the show's run. Due to time pressures, Dominic Glynn's arrangement of the theme tune comes off as anemic, though he's since provided some remixes which sound a million times better. In the end, Glynn's version of the theme would only be heard for this one season.
Now, much of the evidence you saw was totally at variance with my own memory. Therefore, it has been deliberately distorted.
The final 2 episodes begun by Robert Holmes and completed by the Bakers are known as the ultimate foe. Despite the gulf in talent, the Bakers were pros and for the most part delivered a decent final episode. For the most part. The Keeper of the Matrix testifies that the Matrix cannot be altered until this fella pops up live from the Matrix. Also on hand, 2 surprise witnesses, Mel and Glitz. Cast your mind back to the first story of this season, where after a couple of months anybody still paying attention would finally learn that the secrets from the first story were in fact stolen from the Matrix.
The Sleepers had found a way to break into the Matrix, and they were creaming off all this high-tech info to take back to Andromeda.
But then there's the real reason for the Valeyard's motives in prosecuting the Doctor.
They made a deal with the Valeyard, or as I've always known him, the Doctor.
What a twist of lemon.
Did you call him the Doctor?
The Valeyard is all the Doctor's bad vibes balled up into one incarnation somewhere between his 12th and final body, back when that limit was a real thing. His deal with the High Council of the Time Lords was to get the Doctor's remaining regenerations, in return for burying the Doctor so they didn't uncover the High Council's orders to move Earth out of orbit to cover up the theft from the Matrix.
They put an ancient culture like the Earth to the sword for the sake of a few miserable, filthy scientific advances?
Almost everything that doesn't take place in the courtroom in this episode takes place in the Matrix itself, with the Doctor dealing with the Valeyard's metaphorical base of operations, and exploding feathers, and bureaucratic Onslow. So far, the production values of these last 2 episodes have been much higher than the rest of the season, until of course we get to the Valeyard's ultimate weapon, which computer programmer Mel calls a
megabyte modem.
Look, I ain't letting her program a VCR to tape EastEnders after that. It feels like they had 5 minutes to dash out an ending on location, but everybody had left the script back at the hotel, so they just made up some bollocks on the fly. And it was all going so well. The Doctor is exonerated, the Master's plan is foiled. The Valeyard's plan is also foiled.
Miss Purple Gillian Brown is alive and well and living as a warrior queen with King Yrcanos.
And so the Doctor and Mel can go off into the TARDIS, but let's wring that lemon a little bit more since... Okay, look, those last 2 episodes were mostly pretty good. Atmospheric until that one poorly chosen location. The writing is mostly good, almost making up for the flat parts all season. Colin Baker probably gets his single best speech of the entire series.
Daleks, Sontarans, Cybermen. They're still in the nursery compared to us. 10 million years of absolute power. That's what it takes to be really corrupt.
But after all of that, ratings were significantly down on the previous season, and even fan reaction at the time was not great, but at the same time provided us all with a lesson in the long game, irony and karma.
It hasn't improved that much since it went off the air.
But there was good news, and there was bad news. John Nathan Turner had wanted to move on from his job as Doctor Who producer, but at the same time was clearly not liked by his bosses. J&T by this stage seemed to have been better suited for a job as a light entertainment producer, yet here he was in the drama department. The BBC reluctantly renewed the series for a 24th season, but Powell told J&T that he would be returning to Doctor Who if he wanted to remain as a BBC staff producer. Basically, Doctor Who would only be back if he stayed to produce.
Who could keep a creature in such torment?
Oh, indeed. The other sting, he'd have to sack Colin Baker. There's been some conjecture that this was a ploy to get J&T to resign to back up his star, but that didn't happen. J&T called the actor on the telephone to tell him of the good news, bad news scenario. The BBC would later cheekily ask Baker to come back for a 4-part story where he would regenerate at the end. Baker, sensing the knock-on effect for his career, countered with doing at least 1 full season and then regenerating. But if you're the BBC and have no fucks left to give to Doctor Who, then we end up what we ended up with.
What are you, a comedian?
No, more a sort of clown, actually.
So unfortunately, these ended up being the 6th Doctor's last words before regenerating.
Carrot juice, carrot juice, carrot juice.
Colin Baker took the news with fairly good grace, all things considered. His love of the show meant he didn't cut it out of his life. He would return to the role to replace John Pertwee in the late 80s Doctor Who stage show The Ultimate Adventure. He would also return to the role in various specials, and has featured in a successful series of 6 The Doctor audio adventures for Big Finish.
I would enjoy that.
My boy CB was done dirty. He never stopped being a booster of the series, so while I can't say he was my absolute favourite Time Lord, Colin Baker is a damn good guy. Oh, and there were no Daleks this season, but if they had been around, what would have been their reading of the situation Doctor Who was in?
Whoa, we're halfway there. Whoa, we're living on a prayer. Take my hand, we'll make it, I swear. Whoa, we're living on a prayer.
You've been travelling with me long enough to know that none of this really matters.
So we have a story that's fairly well written, but not always that well made. We have a story that's well made, but not always clear what's going on. We have a story that's perfunctory and adequate, but sort of does the job. Then we have a pretty good wrap-up that actually makes the whole season seem almost worthwhile. Almost. Doctor Who would be back in 1987 with Bonnie Langford returning. And of course, there'd have to be a new Doctor. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, leave a comment below, or check out some of our other videos.